I am thrilled to be out of the house. It's been crazy. Just waiting to get out, and the Zoom thing is fun, and I'm getting more reach by going out and doing Zoom conferences, which is awesome. But when I can't see an audience, it drives me crazy. And it's real tough to have your presentation and an audience and kind of click all of that. So to be back here with all of you, especially in Bay City, this is my favorite museum. It's very, very unique to me because, first of all, we did Storm here twice. I've done the opening day for the second Saturdays forever, and I'm just thrilled to be here and to have a crowd like this. It's really special to me, and to bring this topic too, because you know the number one question I get is either about the Edmund Fitzgerald or, hey Rick, what's the most famous shipwreck of all? And I thought, man, I wish I had time to really research that. And I made a special prayer, and of course my prayer came true when PBS laid off a third of us in Detroit. And in last March, I'm like, now what am I going to do? So I decided I'm going to research. This is exactly the time that I have. And the one thing that we now have that we didn't have even 15 or 20 years ago is the ability to go to the internet and scan newspapers. 609 million newspapers I could scan with the click of a couple buttons. So not just one service, but about 15 services I went through with keywords famous shipwrecks, or in the case of my new book, Message in a Bottle. And I got all of those details, put them together, wrote a book on my day off all summer, and wrote a podcast, a 4-hour podcast on the Edmund Fitzgerald. I'll give you an address, you can go there. There's 4 new podcasts, so 14 hours on my website. I'll help you to go there. Most of it is free to listen to, so you've got something to do now for at least a little while. But when I took out those results for what was the most famous, I was surprised to see a headline that just said, Rick, stop here. The most famous was St. Paul. But I know that it actually goes a little bit earlier than that, and that's what I want to talk about. And then we'll talk about why St. Paul is so significant in the shipwreck world as well. So let's go way back to where writing first started. So when we say famous, we have to say what made it famous. Well, it probably had to be written down. In order for it to be widespread, we have to go back to the time of the first library. So let's go back to Ashurbanipal. This guy was, you can tell, a very significant leader because he kills lions with an arrow in the head and then stabs them too. So he was not only a very aggressive hunter, apparently, but he also had the world's first massive library. And when we're talking about libraries back then, we're talking about cuneiform. So as we look around Iraq, the ancient city of Nineveh, the tablets that they had back then for writing were just clay that they would take out of the Tigris, the Euphrates River. They'd make these tablets, and then learned students would go in and make symbols that would actually tell stories. Most of the stuff that they found in shambles now at the library, which they've actually discovered a lot of it, is mostly business accounts. So these turned out to be, you know, what was on board a ship or what was involved in a caravan and record keeping. But there were also incredible stories, and the stories always seemed to hinge around a major god, and the one that was always big was the god of wind and thunder. The god of wind and thunder ruined everybody's day. He came in and ruined crops, he sank ships. You know, there's a lot of stories that go around there, and Ishkur was the one in Babylonia that was the worst of the worst. Adad, if you're Akkadian, if we have any Acadia fans here. Here's the tablet. Does anybody read cuneiform? Well, thank heavens I've had 9 months to learn it because I've been home all by myself, so I'm going to read a little bit for you. It goes, let's see where we should start. Let's start up here. Ut bud bin ashur akura, makura, forgive me, it's akura before E and after C. I kid you. Makura zer nerma, and then they say Nupishtim, which is the significant character inside this, and then in the very bottom right here you can see Udlitz. What they're saying is a story of 2 gods that were fighting, and the story is going to ring kind of true for all of you who've read pretty much any story. This is actually the story of Atrahasis, and the story of how Enki and Enlil were talking, and Enki basically was upset with the world. He basically said it was too noisy with all the people that were on there, and so he was going to come down and rain upon the earth and destroy all humans because they were too noisy. So in order to stop him, all the other gods made a promise and said, we won't tell the humans what's going to happen. But the one god said, Enlil said, you know what I'll do? I'm going to go ahead and talk to this wall. So when I said Nepishtim ut litz, that's when they're talking, Nepishtim's talking to the wall, not to the humans, because remember they promised not to talk to the humans, and basically said, hey wall, build an ark, tear down your house, and save lives. That's what that Babylonian phrase was. So what does it sound familiar to? Noah's Ark. So this is a story literally thousands of years before Noah's Ark story even came out. And as we look at this, Enlil made a deal once he found out that he'd been had, and that the humans found out and actually brought 2 of the animals on board and saved mankind as well. He said, I won't do that again as long as you allow me to capture at least 1 child and keep the world in check. Which to me, it kind of rang true to another story that just scared the heck out of me as a kid. Remember the child catcher? This is from Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. You've got to remember this. This is what my nightmares, Planet of the Apes and Chitty Chitty Bang Bang's child catcher. So I think that this is really where it goes back to if you look at it. The cuneiform tablets started this entire process of storytelling, and we see this story of the flood go through, and it wraps around again. We get to the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is basically the same with just different names about building a boat. And it turns out that this new Noah, his name is Utnapishtim, and basically this Noah is given immortality so he can live forever. And Gilgamesh is trying to find this ability to live forever, and that's why he goes to Utnapishtim, an incredible journey to be able to get there. So these stories are thousands of years old. They've been translated now, and if you ever want to look them up, many of them, including the epic, have already been made into movies as well. We go from now Babylonia to Egypt, where now we start to switch from cuneiform, which was almost readable for us, but to see the pictures that happen in hieroglyphics, we start to see a common theme that happens all the way through the time, especially if you look at the stelas. The stelas are like a little headstone that they'd put together. This one's at the Detroit Institute of Arts, which ironically was the last place I gave a lecture before COVID. As I was leaving, they said, well, we're going to shut down the institute. And I said, why? And they said, well, there's a sickness going around. And I'd heard, of course, of COVID, but I didn't realize it was going to be that impactful. And that was my last talk for a year. So I went over and I did take a picture here, and I zoomed in. Here's our boat, which plays a huge role as you look at Egyptian history especially, and you look at the underworld, and these guys, when you see Amet and the devourer of souls, Osiris, each one of these people, or these creatures, all have a role in, especially the pharaohs, as they would transit, die, and then go to the netherworlds where they would live. And basically they used a scale. So the Osiris would sit there and measure out exactly how good each person was. And if they would basically truth it, not by saying, hey, Rick did all these great things, he helped build a school or did this. They'd go, Rick never hurt anybody. Rick never killed anybody. Rick never tripped anybody. That's how they do it. It's like a negative thing that they go through and qualify you to go to the underworld. And when you did, you'd actually get to go on a boat and go through to eventually meet Ra and take the voyage that goes through. So all the way through our hieroglyphics in the Book of the Dead, we see talk about ships, and specifically shipwrecks, where this actually says, don't be shipwrecked by Osiris on your way to eternity. So this is a story of the shipwreck, and probably the first illustrated history we have of shipwrecks out there. Do we have those ships? We do. Believe it or not, at many of the pyramids in Giza, they've actually unearthed these yachts, because they would take the yachts, and we don't know for sure if the pharaohs were actually sailed, their bodies were sailed on these, but we do know that they were taken apart and stored in little tombs near the pyramid so they could be reassembled in the afterlife, and the pharaohs would have transport. So now we have these incredible, at least 3 of them, examples of early ships. Most of the time, if you look on the bottom of the Great Lakes, we see just broken pieces of ships, and we have to kind of figure out, and we're lucky enough to have, photographs, and even before that, woodcuts that would show us what they look like. We don't only know through drawings if this was possible. Well, now they can actually put them together in a kit and actually see what these ships look like. So early shipwrecks. As a kid, I was fascinated by Phoenicia, as these were the first sailors who, really took to looking at the stars and using navigation. Instead of just following the shore, which we call dead reckoning, they would venture out into the middle of the ocean in the Mediterranean, and they could use the stars to navigate to where they want to go with very good accuracy and make it back. And the Phoenicians, being famous for trading, they would bring their purple dyes, which the name Phoenicia comes from. Well, of course, in the Mediterranean with big storms, these Phoenician ships were lost, and we're discovering them in very deep water. And we don't see a lot of wood, because in the oceans there's critters that eat up the wood. They'll dissolve bone and they'll dissolve wood. We also get, unfortunately, salt water will eat anything that has any kind of metal in it too, so it goes a lot more rapidly than the Great Lakes. But we do have amphora that are all over the bottom, and this is actually a dive by Bob Ballard that went down to 1,500 feet, and you can almost make out what the actual hull of the ship looked like just from these amphora, these storage devices. And they could even tell by the pointed bottom on these amphoras that these were actually from Carthage. So now we know that this was, they were traveling great distances to get to Africa. And, to go in and take traces out of each one of these amphoras too. The shipwrecks are unveiling a lot about what life was like even 1,000 years before Jesus. The big story that we had that was actually printed was the Iliad and the Odyssey, and Homer's work is really one of the first fiction novels based on many stories that we believe to be true. And if you think about Ulysses and his grand quest after they conquered Troy, and as he's trying to get back, he went through all kinds of problems, including 2 shipwrecks. And it turns out that they tied in a lot of god stories to that, with the Romans having a lot of their own gods, and with the Greeks having their own gods. Aeolus was the god of wind, and he made a promise to Odysseus when he got there, because every time there was a bad thing that happened, Odysseus believed it was Poseidon that was stopping him. So when his ship was sunk and he had to live with the beautiful Calypso on the island, the beautiful nymph that loved him so, he didn't want to be there anymore. He wanted to get home to his wife, and so he built another ship and made it, and that one sank. And he finally meets up with Aeolus, who gives him a bag of wind and says, "Take this bag of wind," the very first wind bag in history, which I'm only the third. No. The bag of wind was designed so that it would give him a west wind to blow him back home. And unfortunately, his crew got too excited and opened it at the wrong time. And of course, that led to more problems throughout the journey. But as we get into recorded history now, we really have to talk about the Bible and where these stories, if you're going to talk the most famous, the most printed book in history is the Bible. So as we look at who is the ultimate PR agent for Jesus, was St. Paul. Here's a guy that basically said, I would stone Christians at first, and then God appears to him, and he knows that now he has to help Jesus on his quest to his own, real pain. He'd go to all of the synagogues where the Jewish people were, and St. Paul would be screaming, hey, no, don't listen to them, listen to me. And of course that got him into trouble. The Romans said, you're gonna have to, for your own protection, lock you up. So the Romans took him into custody, and they were going to, he goes, well, before you do anything, I have to let you know that one of my parents is Roman. Well, instantly now he can have an audience with Caesar. So St. Paul is now, can't just be locked up, he has to be taken back to Rome where he can get his official trial with Caesar himself. So he gets on board the boat, and what do you think happens? Yeah, it sinks. Big storm, and it's very, very spelled out on what exactly happened. We don't know exactly where. Probably Malta is where some people talk. They talk about casting out a rear anchor, a large anchor, and how many people were on board, that it was a Carthaginian ship. So there's a lot of details that are in there that lend it to be, a true story. And then as we start to advance into history, of course, the quest is to find, first of all, Noah's Ark. We've seen TV shows. If anybody lived through the 70s and the early 80s, every other T-shirt or every other TV show was the quest for Noah's Ark on TV. But there's also people looking off of Malta for anchors. And what do you know? They find some. And the question has always been, the ship was from North Africa, so it would have Egyptian heritage on it. And they found one big anchor that actually had Isis written on it. So here's a goddess from Egypt on an anchor. So it lends to a lot of credibility that it could have been at least tied to, of course there was probably more ships like that. But it certainly plays into the story that's played out in the Bible as well. We also have artifacts that we know are pretty incredible. In Ankithra, if you look at this in 60 BC, this Greek island, they bring up this mechanism, and you really couldn't tell back in 1901 what it was like. And the worst thing they could have done is to tear into it to try to get to the middle part. It's all encrusted over and stuff. And in Ankithra, they came in and found literally later with X-rays, they could rebuild the mechanism that was there, and they're learning now that these pieces were almost like a way of telling the phases of the moon. Some people believe that it actually told about the Greek games when they would actually have the Olympics. So there's a lot of inner details on how the moon phased and where planets were and stuff that were all geared in this little thing that they found at the bottom of the ocean. So it's a very interesting machine that we still don't know everything about. Christopher Columbus, of course, had a shipwreck. I was never taught that in school, but we know the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria were the ones that all sailed in to discover the New World. Well, of course, as he's going back, he has to wait for the winds to change direction because he took the trade winds over, and now he's got to wait for a later part of the year to be able to go back and then head further south. And as he goes around Haiti, he loses one of his ships. He specifically told the crew, don't let the cabin boy drive the boat. And guess what happened? Cabin boy drove the boat, put it up on a reef, and tore out its bottom, and the Santa Maria was lost. So they took, again, through all of his diaries, Columbus wrote very intricate diaries of what was discovered and what happened. He talks about tearing apart the boat and using all those pieces to build the first settlement on Haiti. So we now know that there's probably not a lot of the boat left. But of course, with history, we have people that come out and start to say, well, I've discovered the Santa Maria. And there's been a couple of people that have actually come out. And one actually took this picture and said it was a cannon that was from the Santa Maria. Now, whether or not that's true, I don't know, but it vanished. And they even admitted, well, it was probably stolen, but then just kind of dropped the story at that. So did they find something from then? And we'll learn a little bit later on that cannons are a fantastic way of actually proving where the ship actually came from. But because this one vanished, most people don't believe what they found was parts of the Santa Maria. But what an amazing shipwreck would be found, and certainly one of the three most famous ships that we can recall from our childhood. The Rose is one of the ones that, and the Vasa are the two that we've preserved that are just amazing. This one, if you look at it, is a British warship, and they brought it up from the mud, and you can tell by everything destroyed above it, that's where the mud line was, and everything below it is where it was protected from oxidation. So the ship was actually preserved underneath enough that they could bring it up. The problem is, once you bring up an artifact like that, you have to preserve it somehow. Most of them use glycol, which will let the water go out, and the glycol will preserve the wood so it's intact. Sadly, on the Great Lakes, a lot of people will go down and pull off a piece of shipwreck that's been down there for 100 years, put it in their garage, and within 2 years it turns into dust. So it's horrible to think that, without a good process, you would never bring up a piece of a shipwreck. And certainly they're putting millions of dollars into an amazing artifact with a warship that barely got to really sail. The Etosha, too, is another one from Florida. You probably heard Mel Fisher found this vessel, and the Etosha was carrying over $400 million worth of gold and jewels, and they're still finding material off of there. The quest was so intense that Mel Fisher lost his son in the dives that would happen trying to bring up this treasure. But it's hard to talk about famous shipwrecks without talking about the Etosha for sure. The Vasa was lost in August of 1628, raised up in Sweden in 1961. And what's significant about, look at how ornate this vessel was. And what they did, the king basically told the architects, I want to make, a ship that will bring fear to all of our enemies and end the wars. And they told him how many guns they could put on there, and he said, you know what, I want 17 more. And they told the king, that's not a good idea. It's going to make it so it's lopsided, and any gust of wind could push it over. And the king said, no, you're going to do that. The good news is they didn't even put all the guns on it. Many of them were still at the foundry when they launched this ship. It sailed out for not even a mile, and a gust of wind came and flipped it over. Many people were drowned. It was brand new. It never saw the war, and it sank down into the mud. And the good news is that they've actually raised this up now, and you can go and visit this. It's an amazing artifact, and when you think of a ship that was built, in the 15th century, that you can actually go and see and walk around. When I saw the early video from this, it was raining down. They were still trying to keep it moist. They had a special solution that was actually coming down as rain on the wreck itself. The hope is that eventually it'll be dried out and they would, put a glycol solution. They've also gone to freeze drying many shipwrecks too, which sounds crazy, but that's another way to get the moisture out. I can't miss our Great Lakes shipwrecks, because when you talk about famous, and if anybody's seen my talk on La Salle and Le Griffin, this is the one movie. People tell me, Rick, why don't they make a movie on the Edmund Fitzgerald? And I said, before you even think about making a movie about the Fitz, we've got to see a full-length feature on Griffin. This has all of the different parts of just a thriller story and all kinds of shipwrecks. In fact, LaSalle at first builds one ship to sail on Lake Ontario, but realizes he can't sail to the upper Great Lakes or even down to where he wanted to go, the Mississippi, because Niagara Falls was in the way. So they used this ship called the Frontenac to sail across Lake Ontario, bring the pieces for Le Griffin to be built on the other side of the falls. And as they're building this ship, the Frontenac runs aground. The pilot actually crashes the ship and sinks it. And of course, in all of his diaries, LaSalle talks about how, I shouldn't have let him drive, but there's not many other pilots, so guess who gets to be captain of Griffin? The same guy that sank the Frontenac. So the good news is they actually do get the ship built, even though many of the Native Americans wanted to burn it. They see it as competition to build this giant canoe, this amazing vessel that can haul 100 times what their bateaus or canoes can haul, and they wanted to destroy it. So he launched early, got into the lakes, had to pull it against the current of the Detroit River to get onto Lake Huron. As they go through Lake St Clair, it was the Feast of St Clair, so they named Lake St Clair. The river is named for St Clair because of LaSalle. And as they sailed around Saginaw Bay, the bay that we know so well as our home, they almost sank. And this big storm kicked up, and the Saginaw Bay is notorious for this. And all the crew were down on their knees praying to God, please get us through this, except Luke the pilot, who basically stood there and swore at LaSalle, saying, look what you got me into again. So they make it through the storm after LaSalle promises to God that he will build a church for St. Anthony, who is the official patron saint of sailors. He never builds the church, so we kind of know that it's not going to turn out real well for LaSalle. He gets to northern Lake Michigan, so somewhere around Green Bay. We're not sure if it might be Washington Island. It might be north of there, Summer Island. And he loads it up with furs, which the king told him he shouldn't do. The king told him he could handle buffalo furs, but could not infringe on the beaver fur trade. So he wants to get money back from all the people he lent money from, including family members and higher ups in the government. And he tells Griffin, we'll stay here, you take the furs back. And he took off, and as they sailed down in canoes, now going down to lower Wisconsin to get into the river system, the Wisconsin River, to get it to Mississippi, to follow where Marquette and Joliet were. Basically, the Griffin sails out, a big storm hits the canoes, and of course the worst happens. The Griffin vanishes. At first, LaSalle thinks that his crew took off with his furs. He didn't trust Luke, the pilot, anyways, but later finds out through Native American tales that they did see a big vessel wrecked, and the quest has been on ever since now to try to find this. For LaSalle, he does get all the way down to the ocean, goes back to France. The king says, well, go back and claim all of that area around Louisiana, which LaSalle named for King Louis XIV, Louisiana. Go back there, come back, and let's build a settlement. So he brings a ship back, 3 ships, can't find Louisiana, sails to Texas instead, loses all 3 ships. So one sinks called Lebel, and they actually found Lebel, believe it or not. I'll show you a picture of Lebel in a second, but this plays into where is the Griffin. Many accounts say he was lost between Green Bay and where is now the Mackinac Bridge. So probably around Sechua, which is a place called the only choice of harbor that you have. And a storm came up, so they probably tried to get over to that area where there's a cool lighthouse, by the way. There also talk about how it made it all the way over to Manitoulin Island, which I don't believe, because they would have went through the Straits of Mackinac without stopping to resupply, which would be ludicrous. And LaSalle had told them to stop at the Straits, so I don't believe they made it there. But this is the wreck in Manitoulin that many people thought, because it was really old, that it had to be the Griffin. And I don't believe it is. The charred remains that I saw look more like it's pieces of the Burlington, which was a steamer that caught fire. There were pieces on the beach that vanished too. Again, the story goes in all the newspapers that claimed at the top, this is LaSalle's boat, that it's so old it has to be, and no real proof was ever brought out of it. And a second story came out of Hessel, where that famous boat show goes on now. And in Birch Island, I thought, I'll never find this shipwreck. I saw in 1935 a headline that LaSalle's Griffin was found here. And lo and behold, I go to Google Earth when we had really low water levels, and you can see on the top picture, here's the wreck that they were talking about. Driving out on the ice in 1935 to try to bring it up, the Chamber of Commerce in Hessel thought this would be an amazing tourist attraction to have what has to be LaSalle's boat, because it's so old. This is the quotes we see in the paper. I went actually and did a dive on it, and there was this giant bolt through there, which nothing was ever described like this in any of the building materials that they talked about with LaSalle, and especially with LaSalle's boat that was found later on. But I want our chief underwater archaeologist of Michigan to tell you about, he's had this job for a couple of years, and how many people have called in to say, I found Lebel, or I found LaSalle's Griffin. Here's Wayne Lasardi.
The shipwreck's been pretty interesting. It's the Griffin, of course, is the oldest European vessel that's thought to be in the upper Great Lakes. And it's been sought after since the day it sank in the 1600s. And so there have been many claims of Griffin sightings, and all of them have not come to fruition. I've been working as a state maritime archaeologist since 2002, and I've gone on 17 Griffins, only 2 of which were actually shipwrecks. The rest were things like net stakes and telephone poles and pole barn fragments and rock formations and other things. And so it remains elusive. It has not yet been found. I say that with all authority. Will it be found? I don't know. It depends, I guess, on the circumstances of its loss and exactly how it broke up or didn't break up or where it settled, that sort of thing.
So now we wonder, why is it that we hear so much about it being found? Why isn't it just kind of discounted immediately if the archaeologist says, hey, I'll go take a look at it? The reason is so many of these discoveries are actually not going to state officials or going to historians. The first place they call when they find an old ship is the news media. And they tell the news media, hey, listen, I've got the Griffin, and these guys don't have any way of proving it. They think they've got a scoop because this is a 1679 shipwreck that was lost, the first fatal shipwreck on the Great Lakes, and they just run with the story. So we get stories out of Frankfurt where they said they actually found a Griffin head. It turned out to be part of the trunnion in the back of the ship. There was a steam pump on board this shipwreck that the underwater archaeologist laughed. He said the French were advanced, but they didn't have steam for 150 years. Actually, we're talking more like 250 years at that point. Then we had another one that was clearly a net stake, and it's still coming up in the media over and over again when he took it in to get an MRI scan of this post, trying to somehow prove that it's part of the wreck. And my hope is that you'll actually find something tangible, and that's really from a wreck that's that old in the Great Lakes. You will find something significant. This is Lebel. This is one of the 3 ships that after LaSalle lost the Griffin and went back to France and came back. This is one that sank off of Texas, and they found it. And what they did was build a cofferdam all the way around it out of metal, and they pumped all of the Gulf of Mexico out of this big circle, and they found 1.5 million artifacts, from little tiny beads for trading with the Native Americans to everything that you would need to build a settlement. So, gardening equipment and all kinds of guns, and especially cannons, and I mean, things that literally could not be confused with anything else. When you take a cannon that has the marking of King Louis on it and the maker's mark of when it was actually cast, that tells you exactly when that ship had to be, you know, a time not before that, but it had to be a time after that cannon was made. So this is what we want to see when Le Griffin is finally found. One of the 3 cannons they talk about, and there's also smaller guns. I believe 7 was the total count. And this will be found on a magnetometer, and zebra mussels won't affect this. It'll be coated, but you'll clearly see probably the crown on the cannon. So that's what I'm hoping that we'll find sooner or later. And of course, this is what we've been bringing up, the pirate ships that have been coming off the ocean. Blackbeard Ship, this was a part that came up, and again, big, all kinds of legal issues that came along with this too, on who owns the shipwreck when it's found, who can tell the story that's on board. But this is the cannon from Blackbeard's ship. In the Great Lakes, this is another one that's in the Canadian side in Lake Ontario, and it was lost in 1813, so it was one of the warships of the War of 1812. And on the bow you can actually see a carved figurehead, and the Canadian government felt that this is one of the 3 shipwrecks, including Fitzgerald, the Hamilton and Scourge being the other. Here's the Scourge. Because of the guns that are on board, it's a high value that people would try to take these things. They sealed this area off and told, you know, you can't dive this. This is one that Jacques Cousteau actually did come and film for his special on the St. Lawrence Seaway in the Great Lakes. And they actually lost 2 divers on a wreck not far from here too, which was tragic when the Calypso came here. But yeah, that was amazing shipwrecks. We're hoping to learn more about this. There's a new process where they're doing photo mosaics out of video, and the plan is to hopefully do these ships in that so that we have 3D models that are always preserved, because eventually these decks will collapse, especially when you have heavy cannons on deck. It doesn't take long for the ships themselves to start to take, you know, to the conditions of the lake, even though they're pretty deep, over 150 feet deep. I wanted to show you this wreck because this one was one of my big surprises as I started looking at ships and collisions on the Great Lakes. You know, you look at 1873 and you realize that you've never heard of this shipwreck. It was a collision, and sadly there was a great loss of life when the schooner ran into the steamship. And as I'm looking at the different headlines that are on there, it gave a list of the passengers who were lost. And look at the names on here. Mrs. Hunter and Mixter sunk. This is my great-great-great-great-grandniece that was on a shipwreck that was lost, and I had no idea that this had happened. It turns out that her father was lost, you know, just like Titanic, where the men weren't to get on the boats. He was a big deal in Boston, and of course I'm still waiting for my settlement checks out of all of this, but it's probably going to be a long wait for me. But to see a tie to it and pictures of the people, I mean, it really tied it into me. The same way that I found out after doing, I think, 15 years of lectures on stage, and my mother sits down with me and says, well, you do know that my great-grandfather was a lifesaver on the Great Lakes. I'm like, could you not have told me that like years ago? So, but it turns out that he was involved in 3 different shipwrecks in Muskegon where they worked out of an area called Devil's Kitchen, and he actually got thrown out of the service because he couldn't swim. So always learn to swim if you're going to save people in the ocean. Here's another picture from a woodcut of the ship actually going down. This is mid-ocean, so we'll probably never see, or, you know, people go to look for what, you know, would be left in there. Of course, we're coming up on April 15th, the anniversary of the Titanic. It's hard to argue famous shipwrecks without bringing up Titanic and the loss that was there, the tragedy of men saying goodbye to their families, and many of the stories we don't even know all the truths for. In fact, in my book, I found out that there's 3 different bottles that came ashore from Titanic, and 2 of them just don't make any sense, but one of them really kind of rings true. The one that really doesn't make a lot of sense was the aide to the President Taft that went down. His name was Archibald Butt, and of course he was the butt of a lot of jokes back then. For some reason the Houston Post was just always on him, trying to dig into his personal life or when he was going to get married. It was almost like our tabloids we have today, kind of a la Kardashian, but they dig at this guy. Well, then when the Titanic goes down and he's lost, they have to turn around and start publishing nice things about him. And many of the stories became way blown out of proportion, where he was shooting people or threatening them to make sure you give this lifeboat to this woman. We don't know what the exact truth is, but we do know a bottle came ashore that said, "I'm on a life raft and I'm running out of food and I hope I make it." There were no life rafts on the Titanic, so we don't know how true it was. There's not a mention after the secretary of President Taft says, "Yeah, we're looking into it." Not a mention about whether or not it was true or what happened, but there are 2 memorials built to him. In fact, the gentleman he was with too was actually involved in building the Lincoln Memorial and actually picked the spot of it. So in DC there's a special fountain for them, and at New York City there's also for all of the victims of the Titanic, especially the telegraph operator, there's a memorial for them as well. This is the one that was found in the bottle by a guy named Burke, and it says from Titanic. Look at the date though, it's before the ship sank. So it's like, why did he say goodbye all? We know Burke was from Cork, and that's when the boat pulled into Ireland. Why on earth would this bottle float all the way from Newfoundland all the way back to Ireland in the exact port where it left from? My guess is that he wasn't saying goodbye, all we're drowning. I think when he was leaving for America to go live with his sister in Boston, he was basically saying goodbye to everybody in Ireland. It makes more sense that the bottle would have washed ashore there and have this message, but we'll never know for sure. And this is one of the very few preserved messages in a bottle that we still have. Wait a minute, that shouldn't bring up a good time for a commercial, shouldn't it? Let's do it. Messages in a bottle are nothing new. They've communicated requests for pen pals, even hope for rescue and tragic farewells ever since waterproof containers were actually invented. Christopher Columbus even locked details of his discoveries into a cask during a Valentine's Day storm that nearly sank the Nina and Pinta on their way home. Titanic had no less than 3 bottled goodbyes, one allegedly floating to its port of call in Ireland, and another from a senior White House staff member that came ashore in Rhode Island. Now you can read about these and other fascinating floating farewells in my new book, Bottled Goodbyes. Many of the stories are very familiar, including the Christmas tree ship. But 5 schooners have been lost with their cargo of Christmas trees. Why is it the Rue Simmons endures? I'll explore why. And I'll also talk about the 5 bottles found during the King of Storms, the 1913 storm, including one that washed ashore on this beach. The schooner Plymouth was lost with 7 hands, with a final farewell from Chris Keenan. Other stories will be brand new and from all corners of the Great Lakes, including a gold medal winning rescue after rowing 20 miles to catch the schooner Noise. Bottled Goodbyes will also cover the 139 flights of the balloonatic Washington Donaldson, who flew his balloon over Lake Michigan and vanished. Mysteries with written goodbyes from the Bannockburn, Alpena, Chicora, Manistee, and the message tube that came ashore with the car ferry Milwaukee. The overwhelming majority of these bottles are truthfully hoaxes, with insurance companies even offering rewards to capture anybody who would be so cruel as to cast one into the water. Some of these eyewitness accounts were actually used as testimony in court, as loved ones sued because of mistakes outlined in these bottled goodbyes. Why is it we don't hear more about bottled messages? Well, that's because we have radio and satellite communication that can bring almost instantaneous help with helicopters and rescue boats. In my book, Bottled Goodbyes, we'll talk about development of radio on the Great Lakes and investigate one of the first times CQD was used in the rescue of the Pierre Marquette 18. Bottled Goodbyes, messages from the most famous shipwrecks around the world. Watch for it at your favorite maritime museum or online at lakefury.com. One of the greatest parts about putting that book together was getting through the chapter on the Pierre Marquette 18 and then having Jerry Eliason announce he found the Pierre Marquette 18. So here I had all this research, 200 newspaper articles on what it was all about, and I called him up and I said, listen, I'm really impressed by the ship. They found it, it's laying in deep water, but it's pointing straight up off the bottom. So the bow is pointing way off, 100 feet off of the bottom. And I said, I've got some articles for you. And he goes, goes, well, I've got a lot of research. I said, oh, trust me, I've been bored these last couple of months. So I came up with new things that are in the book, talking about the telegraph operator and how it wasn't his real name, just diving into all kinds of minutia, if you will, but things that just fascinated me as I was reading. And it was really an interesting time to be able to spend as much time as I wanted to get it done. Another tragedy that happened on the Great Lakes that's almost too tough to talk about is the Eastland disaster. And in many ways, I don't really do many lectures on it because it was simply an accident at the dock. An entire company was going to go out to a picnic, and they got on board this ship that was designed for the fruit trade, launched in Michigan out of Port Huron area. And it was just a narrow, speedy boat that was used for getting fruit back and forth to Chicago from Michigan. And they turned it into a passenger boat. Well, of course, when Titanic went down, they decided to put more lifeboats on many ships. And this one put too many up top. That with a cement deck made it top heavy. So when they're sitting at the dock and something startled or called attention to people to run to one side, the boat flipped over and 835 people drowned at the dock. And this very spot is the same area where the Christmas tree ship was to dock too. So this is an area that many people, I don't believe in ghosts, but they say it's haunted. And even Oprah Winfrey, who had her studio built there, which was built in the area that had a temporary morgue for the 800 people who were lost here, they still said many of the staff that there actually were ghosts at the noises they heard at her studio when she had it in Chicago there. So tragedy. They had to cut in to try to get the people they could, and many people were lost on here and never even got to obviously go on that excursion. Lusitania is another one, May 7th of 1915. Here's the United States on the brink of war, and the accusations that this vessel was hauling munitions, and it was against, the Germans said, you better not haul things that are resupplying our enemies, and they felt it was a fair target, where many other people said no, it wasn't. Many of the investigations I've seen now say that it probably was. The explosion meant that they were hauling some munitions, but I haven't done enough research on this one to really know. But so many people lost on Lusitania as well. Nothing, everything pales in comparison to the loss of lives on this ship. This is where they launched all of these survivors after the war, basically winding up. The Germans' families were all on board the Wilhelm Gustave, and if you remember the way the Russians were treated when the Nazis invaded, they were merciless. Well, it turns out this was kind of a revenge for them, because this Russian submarine surfaced and threw torpedoes in there, and the estimate now is 9,300 people that were lost in this shipwreck as an act really of revenge. That wasn't a warship at all, but they definitely brought it to the bottom, and they're still trying to figure out how many people were really on that. So you've got to put that into the list too of infamous wrecks. Now, if we're going to try to figure out famous based on how many people go see a shipwreck, it would really be hard to top the Arizona. If you think about, this was our entry into the war officially for World War II, when the Japanese attacked and caught us pretty much off guard. The ship went down, over 1,100 people killed there. It was tragic, and now they've built a fantastic memorial over it so that people can come. So millions of people actually go in and visit this shipwreck and see it. It's off limit to scuba divers. Only divers with NOAA that can check how it's doing for leaking oil and stuff like that. But normal recreational scuba divers can't go out to this wreck at all. But so many millions of people of all around the world come and see this. It's got to be considered one of our famous shipwrecks. I can't leave without talking about the Fitzgerald too. Why is it famous? There's over 6,000 shipwrecks, probably closer to 10,000 wrecks that have been on the Great Lakes. But Gordon Lightfoot only wrote one song, didn't he, on the Edmund Fitzgerald? And it's hard to argue that. I probably wouldn't be on stage here at the State if it wasn't for Gordon Lightfoot bringing attention to the largest shipwreck that went down on the Great Lakes. Now, we've certainly had bigger ships get wrecked but recovered, but this was the one that went down with 29 lives, that 29 men vanished. And why is that significant? Well, it is because all the other wrecks, the largest on Lake Michigan, Michigan, the Carl Bradley, went down with 33 lives. 2 men survived on a life raft. And most of those men were found, the ones that were lost, their bodies were recovered. In the case of the Daniel J. Morrell, launched just literally down the river from here, this is a major shipbuilding mecca with the Wheeler shipyard and all the ships that have come out of here. At the time, one of the largest vessels on the Great Lakes. When it sank in 1966, just an average size and very old for 1906, I think is when they built it here. So 1966, it's out sailing empty, breaks in half. The stern keeps sailing on for 5 miles and the bow goes down. And it's very famous for Dennis Hale, who I'm sure many of you have heard speak. Sadly, Dennis got cancer and passed away, but his story of surviving 2 nights in late November, the 28th of November, wearing just a pea coat and no pants, just his underwear and no shoes, and surviving 2 nights like that. The shipping company didn't know that the ship was missing for 2 days. Helicopters flew past here going up to the Nordmeer to rescue the German crew there, flew over Dennis Hale and the raft of the guys that were on there, could have saved them if they had known they were missing, but they didn't know they were gone. So unfortunately, morale broken in 2 pieces. But there again, most of the crew was found. So how is it possible, November 10th, 1975, an entire crew of 29 vanished? The lifeboats were found, the life rafts, the inflatables were found with nobody in them. And that became the big mystery. And as you know, in 94, we dove it in submarines. Whitefish Point went. I went in 94 in July on the Delta, and we found the first missing crewman, which was significant. And so what happened, and the fact that he was wearing a life jacket was just as significant, that they somehow knew bad things were going to happen. We just had no inclination by the radio traffic from McSorley, the captain of the Fitzgerald, that they knew there was an impending doom, and by putting on a life jacket, the crew at least knew something was up. I spent my summer filming bottles and playing with grandbabies, which is ultimately the greatest thing ever. You'll probably see more of Hannah Wren in the future years. She's already got her own podcast show, so be watching for that. I'm a very proud grandpa, very proud father of kids, and you've probably heard of my son Alex in Saginaw doing all kinds of amazing things with the Charles Lee Mansion, a preservationist that has taken it way beyond what his father could possibly have hoped for or imagined. Now working on his own building, which he called me in on Thursday to haul all the trash out of the green, it's called the Green Block Building, 1901 or 1910, and it's really damaged and poor. I'm old now, so it hurt for 2 days. I'm just now getting to where I can walk straight after hauling all this stuff out there. So it's been fun. It's been a great summer. I hope that we're going to get beyond all of this, but in the meantime, after you get your COVID shots and we finally get clear where we can do more face-to-face stuff. In the meantime, you can go to my shipwreckpodcast.com. Download, you can listen to almost 90% of it for free. So shipwrecks that are on the Carl Bradley, on the loss of the city of Bangor. Most of my stories actually have survivors in them. So you'll hear interviews from 1934 on the Henry Court, a whaleback lost off Muskegon. You'll hear from the city of Bangor, one of the guys that had to walk through the snow when they were stranded out in the Keweenaw Peninsula, and how the captain wanted to carry the bag and he told him no way. So there's amazing stories that you can listen to on your own time. For me, when I was driving, especially back and forth to Saginaw, I need a podcast to throw in the radio, and it's just like listening to old-time radio. So shipwreckpodcast.com. For $20 you can get 4 hours of Edmund Fitzgerald stuff. It's everything that I've ever recorded from the Fitzgerald, starting with the builders of the Fitzgerald, going through the people who sailed it, then into the investigations. Not only did I find the guys from the Wood Rush who raced across from Duluth, but I actually just recently, through the powers of our Zoom meetings, found the P3 Orion crews that were the guys from Illinois that flew submarine detecting aircraft over and found the Fitzgerald. Unfortunately, one of them, P3LX1, went up, found the ship, they marked it, but a storm came up and stole the float. So a second plane had to come up, and you'll hear interviews from 2 different crews that were on those airplanes. And then it goes into all the dives, and I actually spend 20 minutes of audio from me inside the submarine describing what I saw, and there's some pretty incredible things that haven't been really discovered yet. So check it out, shipwreckpodcast.com. shipwreckpodcast.com. lakefury.com has a lot of books and stuff. I also brought some of my favorites, including the new book. Anything up here is $20, and it goes right back into my scuba tanks and gasoline to make another adventure. So I'd love to say hi to you. If you have any questions, I'm more than happy to take them now about famous shipwrecks or just about what you did this summer. What? I answered it all? Oh, yes, please.
It's interesting, on the Eastland, one of the women, they said, this one woman who was curated at the museum forever, she worked in a department store just a block from where that happened. She told me, she said, the woman running screaming and tipped over, and people are dead. So it was lunchtime, she walked down the block and she told me, I wish I went down there. She said, the river was coming to the back.
Yeah, the sad part about the Eastland was, this is when photography was really getting popular, and so cameras were down there too just as fast. And the pictures that you see of firefighters with, dead children in their arms, it just rips your heart out. And it's the reality of the tragedy of what water can do. We're not designed to go underwater. We need scuba tanks, and when bad things happen to ships, that's a reality. And for probably that notion that 835 people were lost, that's why I don't talk a lot about it. The attraction for me, and you probably heard me say this before, but the loss of life is horrible and tragic, but if I dwelled on that, after 9 years at TV5, 4 years at Channel 12, I saw my share of sad things that happened. That's not what intrigues me. What intrigues me are these ships that are 100, 200, in the case of the Griffin, 300 years old, that are still on the bottom, and that we can go down there and be privileged to go over them and to discover the things that might be there. That's a true honor for me. So the body part of it is tragic, and that's probably why you will never hear me up here talking at length about Eastland, because there was really no big story beyond that. And then the sadness of the company that obviously had some real problems with the ship and probably knew it. So there's no good outcome on any of that, and it's difficult. And not that anything's great on the shipwrecks, but the stories of rescue for me are among the greatest stories I've ever told. Yes, sir.
Has the cause of the Edmund Fitzgerald been determined?
It hasn't, and it's been an argument ever since. I come into audiences and start talking. Last year, well, it would be now 2 years ago, I was privileged enough to be able to talk to NASA about it. So the notion of the Fitzgerald goes way beyond the Great Lakes. They wanted to hear more about the wreck, and I was privileged to be able to tell them about it. I'm convinced by my sub voyage that went around that pilot house twice, the first hatch is collapsed in. There's no question in my mind that a wave came up on deck and pushed the nose under, and it never could recover. The question is, why didn't it affect the Anderson, which was just 9 miles behind it? Was it that the Fitzgerald was weighed down in the water because it had leakage, as was indicated by the Coast Guard? They believed that those hatches, which were 21 hatches, had water coming in, and that alone could sink it. Add in the fact that Captain McSorley actually told the Cooper on the Anderson, I've got a vent missing and I'm listing, meaning that the tubes that would actually balance the pressure in their ballast tanks, which had caps on them to secure down so water wouldn't go in them, one of those was washed off. That's an 8-inch opening in the ship now, pouring into the ballast tanks, putting water in there that they couldn't pump out. By his own admission, he's got both pumps running. The ship is now listing. So now we don't know if it was port or starboard. Later in interviews, Captain Cooper said it was starboard, but all of the material that he's given to court testimony, his deposition, all said he didn't know, he'd never heard. So I think that's something that was added later on. But if it's now leaning towards the starboard or to the right, those seas that are coming down, they misjudged the strength of the storm. They could have stayed up by Slate Islands and rode the storm out fine. They thought they could beat the storm by an hour and get past to Whitefish Point and Parisian Island, where they could actually weather behind. they misjudged it. So when they went down there, they got caught in the very worst part of the storm. So now 30-foot waves came up, hit Anderson, damaged the lifeboat, crushed it to where they couldn't use it anymore. And that wave went faster than the Anderson, hit the Fitzgerald, and in a blinding snowstorm, it vanished and when that wave probably hit it. And the facts are on the bottom. I mean, I can tell by the clamps that not all of those clamps were dogged down. In the very back section of the horn section, you'll hear in my audio, I said, those clamps, you can tell the clamps aren't all dogged down because they're intact on the bottom. The ones that were dogged down were stripped off, like stretched out and ripped in half. So there's a good indication that the Fitzgerald was also traveling without them dogged down, because they had forever. Look at any picture of the Fitzgerald underway, and I dare you to show me a picture where they're all clamped down. But boy, that brings up a lot of controversy with sailors. And on Facebook, boy, do I get flamed by people that say, there's no way they would do that. I said, well, every accident has a no way they would have done that, but it happened. So unfortunately it does. But I don't put blame on anybody except the captain, who should not have gone out in that. He knew better. He was a captain that pushed heavy weather and pushed that ship until it broke, and that's what happened. That was a long-winded what happened, wasn't it? Sorry. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Where is the Vasa located?
In Sweden. Stockholm comes to mind, but I don't know for sure. But if you go to Sweden, or even just type in VASA, you'll find all kinds of information. It's one of those things when I get to Europe, I gotta go see. Did you see somebody else? I'm sorry, Mike.
Somebody in the back.
Yes. Yes.
Have you ever thought about going to the Straits of Magellan and going down to any of those wrecks?
I would love to. I'll be honest with you. I've got my hands full with Great Lakes shipwrecks. Even if I continued, doing stories. The first time I started, when I was at Channel 5, I started in 1991. I got certified. In fact, it was right after Jupiter. The newest project I'm working on right now is I just worked out a deal with TV5 and got all of their old tapes on Jupiter, including deposition of the captain and many things that I didn't know existed, and things that didn't show up on TV just because it was just too much. So the first thing I'll do with a lot of this is turn it into a podcast. The second thing I'm going to do with it is actually try to locate some of the people involved. In fact, there was a very famous picture taken of the buffalo. If anybody knows the family, I don't want to call them out right here because I don't want them to get undue pressure, but Rick would love to chat with the people who took the picture of the buffalo, which ultimately led to the court cases being settled out against pretty much everybody. I think they all shared a third of the blame in what happened. But that's what I'm going to work on. For your answer, yeah, the Magellan shipwrecks would be amazing, but with the chapter on Jupiter, which is going to play a big part of my new book called Special Assignment, which talks about all my crazy adventures. So it'll have Fitzgerald, Jupiter, it'll have a lot of stuff on the B-52 flights that I made out of Wurtsmith and K.I. Sawyer, F-16 rides, Goodyear blimp. I'm so excited to be able to, I'm going through all the old video now, reliving some of these amazing opportunities that I was given, and realizing now that because I have it on video, because it was done as a TV story, that still exists for me to be able to tell more people about, and hopefully inspire people to know that if this little Youper kid can get these crazy adventures, maybe you can too. So yeah, I appreciate it. Yep, one more question.
You mentioned the Jupiter, for anyone that doesn't know, there's multiple remnants of the Jupiter. Sailor River Marine Historical Society has on exhibit at the Toyota Fire Truck Museum on Patterson.
Did you guys hear that? The Fire Truck Museum has amazing pieces, from the burned flag that the captain took off the ship to the bollards, the emblem from the stack, the name from the back, I think is still in the yard there, isn't it?
We have the transom with the name on it.
The transom, I think the mast is still there until you guys donate it someplace else too, right?
Well, you can't see where that
Oh, okay. Go into the museum though.
erected in the future.
You bet. Again, you guys have made this so perfect for me. A great outing today. I sure hope you enjoyed my stories. Feel free to come on up, say hi, and I hope to see you again. Mike, did you have anything else you want to tell the people?
Yes, we want to give you a little memento from...
I like mementos.
So thank you. Let's give Rick a round of applause.
Thank you.
That's awesome.
So we're going to give Rick a print of, we had the museum hand painted, and we're going to give Rick a print of that as a memento for our 100-year anniversary.
Awesome.
Thanks, Rick. We're going to have him back, obviously, always, because we always like having him and hearing him about his new stories. Come on up, see what he's got up here, and just to say hi or whatever. Thanks, Rick. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you soon.